Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today we have Michael David Cobb Bowen. And Mike is the founder of the Conservative Brotherhood, Rights Universal, co-founder of Free Black Thought. We know Mike well through Free Black Thought, where we've coordinated with him on several things, and we're going to talk about all that. But before we do, Mike, you know it's the Hold My Drink podcast, and it is Friday evening. What did you bring for this conversation?
Yes. I brought my favorite Nica coffee whiskey.
Ooh, oh,
Well, that sounds good.
that sounds really good.
Yeah,
You
I'm
know,
I
down
might
to the
have to
last
try
of it.
that.
yeah.
Oh, it's really good.
You
Nica
know,
coffee whiskey. I'm actually writing that down.
there's another whiskey that I like. Remember, David, is the peanut butter whiskey, peanut butter cup whiskey. Yeah, but you're not really a whiskey drinker. What are you drinking today, David?
I'm actually drinking scotch on the
Yeah.
rocks. So yeah, I guess I am a whiskey.
Okay, all right, Scotch. I don't know.
It
I
can't
guess
be just scotch. It's got to be some specific kind of scotch.
It's like Glenlivet 17, I think.
Okay.
all right. You're fancy.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
Well, I said it was a dry January, but the weekends I decided don't count. So I've got just Pinot Noir, but look at my glass. Like I'm already ready I kind of got depressed after Christmas. I let it, and so now I'm like celebrating every single holiday. So I'm already ready for Valentine's Day.
Excellent.
All right, so David, I'm Michael. I was looking at Michael David Cobb. You've got a very long name there, by the way, Mike.
It was longer than me for many years.
Yeah, seriously. But I know you as Mike. So, Mike, tell me about you founded. I mentioned already the organizations that you founded: the Conservative Brotherhood, Rights Universal, and Free Black Thought. Like, start at kind of at the beginning on who you are and how you came to your certain viewpoints and what
Sure.
why you started these organizations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm. I sometimes I say that I'm half Black nationalist, half Catholic, and half something else. But I forgot what it was. I haven't used that one in a while. But my father is a Connecticut Yankee, and my mother is a New Orleans Catholic, and he's Episcopalian, and he was also in the Marine Corps. And then my mother is kind of a born again Christian. Uh, so I grew up in Southern California. I'm the oldest of 5 kids, and we had one of those crazy houses where everything's happening all the time, and it's just my dad would call out names and he's like, which one are you? But it was definitely a busy house. And my dad was, I would not say typical, but more typical of those radicals that you would expect from the 60s. So he was a bona fide hardcore Black nationalist. He was originally a separatist. So we believed that we were going to leave the United States and go live in West Africa. And I have an uncle who was originally in the Peace Corps. So we, spoke French. My father began to teach me how to speak Swahili because we were going to have to leave this place. That turned around. We found out the FBI was tapping our telephone, and he says, I'm a family man first, so I'm going to have to quit this radical stuff. And he got into public health. So both of my parents were sociologists by trade and by education. And of course, as social workers, their primary job is to make sure families work. And so I definitely come from one of those completely functional families. And that's not only my immediate family, but one across the board. and we're still all very close. And I've always had those models of success for me, and I was a little, prodigious smartass as a kid, uh, but I had that particular difference, which was I was born when everybody was called a Negro, and then my dad was part of the things that said we're going to do Black consciousness, and so you're going to be Black. And so we celebrated Kwanzaa. We were part of the original Kwanzaa, and my dad had founded the Institute for Black Studies as well as the Redwood Theater Group. And so we were more what is now called a cultural nationalist, because again, with that background and having been in the Marine Corps, he knew the alternative to peace, and it scared the pants off him. As he said, I don't want to raise my kids in that kind of environment. So we were big on culture and language and reading, and he's got all kinds of books that I've inherited. And growing up in Los Angeles was as you would expect, a big multicultural thing. A lot of people forget that the Crenshaw community is a lot of Japanese, first and second generation there, and so we would go to the Nisei Carnival on Crenshaw and Crenshaw Square that burned down during the riots, but has been rebuilt. I had Japanese friends and kids in my school. So I went to public school for elementary. I went to a Catholic middle school and went to an advanced prep school in LA. And I was always kind of a moralist. I had this different set of ethics growing up. And then since my mother was Catholic, and every Catholic is a lapsed Catholic of some sort, and she ended up going to a Pentecostal church, and my dad reverted from his secularness to Episcopalianism. And so I had all kinds of, I had a multi-religious family myself, and then I had to make my own choice. So it was weird going to Catholic school and not being Catholic and learning the catechism along with the kids who got to go to First Communion. And I don't get to go to First Communion or anything like that. And I ultimately went to a Jesuit high school, chose Episcopalianism because it was kind of the very kind of upscale white liberal church that you would expect. And I was like, oh, these guys actually do send money to Africa for a printing press. And so that was kind of gratifying. So I grew up obviously very radical left, but I didn't take it so seriously as I was always into science. I read a lot of science fiction. I read 2001 when I was in the 5th grade. So I got into Heinlein and all of that stuff. Starman Jones. I read all the Nancy Drew books, all the Hardy Boys. I liked all of the Samuel Clemens books, Mark Twain. And so, like my dad, I was a big reader. So I just grew up just a smart kid, a big brother, and with a different upbringing that was different enough for me to say, hey, there's a different way to do things. Let's find out why. And I think we were all kind of evangelistic about Black culture and Black thought as young people, and we were an unusual family. So I would always, well, why don't you do this? And how come you don't do this? And we gave up Christmas to celebrate Kwanzaa. How come you guys just don't even think about that? And so I've always kind of had this central kind of ethical core that followed me, along with an insatiable curiosity to find out what other people were thinking, because I seem so different than everybody else. So that's kind of what set me up for everything.
So, Mike, you founded Free Black Thought. What about the current discourse around race and racism
Mm-hmm.
would lead you in that direction? What needed to be freed?
Yes. Well, of course, as you can imagine, I was, this bona fide cultural nationalist who had family that actually lived in Africa. And so I was authentic. I was the real deal. And my dad, you could point to him and, he was talking to, all the heads in the chatting classes of the 60s. And he was published in his essays. And so I kind of inherited the mantle of the talented 10th. So, you're the educated class of Black people who are going to lead us through whatever it is, the revolution, the education. And so I kind of took that for granted for most of my life. And then when I finally got to college, I realized that I wasn't the one. I grew up thinking I was Neo. I was the one, and everybody should follow me. And when I actually got into campus leadership, I discovered that Black unity just doesn't work, because actually there are multiple Black factions on campus or anywhere else that want to do it their way. Like, we struggled a lot, understanding there's some Marxist bent to Black left liberalism of the 60s with the Black church. The Black church wants to put Jesus as the head, and we want to put economic empowerment as the head. So those two were never really reconciled. And then within that, my own mother was a Catholic, then changed to the Pentecostal, and my dad went from secular to being Episcopalian. So that wasn't even reconciled. So we have all of these differences, but there would be this putative Black leader or Black leaders who were supposed to speak for everybody. And it was tough enough just to get our own neighbors to come to the poetry workshops and stuff that we put on. So there was a role for us, being out ahead of something, being progressive within the Black community. But you kind of realize that the racial unity is not going to work. And there's no better way to learn that than when you try to be the Black leaders of everything. And you end up suppressing dissent, and you end up taking advantage of your privileges, and you end up, dismissing with a special vehemence those who are don't have ability to the cause. And I personally, worked in the Rainbow Coalition, and I met Jesse Jackson many times. And then when I became a student leader, he kind of crashed one of our meetings and started asking for money from students. And so I have recognized the hard way what happens when you try to put all the Black folks into one bucket. And I would add one more thing. When I got into student government on this campus, where we were about, I don't know, 6% Black, if that much, maybe 10, I don't know. But there were at least a dozen Black clubs and organizations, including fraternities and sororities. And I was a School of Engineering and Computer Science finance chair. So I sat on the committee where they dole out the money to the various student organizations. And it was always suggested, kind of perennially, well, why don't you just have one Black organization? Because per capita, you guys are getting more money than everybody else. Why not just have one Black organization? We could fund that organization and then be done with it. And that, of course, would constrain our ability to pursue our different agendas. So, Black unity doesn't work. And I came out of college with that very clear in my mind. And yet there's still people who are jumping to try to catch the reins of Black leadership and lead the country into a particular direction. And it just doesn't work. It's impractical, and it's a bad idea.
That's that's interesting, because I see that while there's not this, I mean, of course, there's some fringe white unity groups or whatnot, but the way that people now are assuming, particularly in this new era where like diversity training and whatnot, and people are looking at whiteness as this monolithic whole and attributing values to whiteness. And I'm like, I'm sorry, that's not me. And so I think that we've kind of switched gears, and now we're doing the same thing. And we're not changing the game. We're just switching out the sides. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
that's how I kind of related to what you just said. What do you think
Yeah.
about that? Do you see that as well?
Yeah, I do. And I think we're more color struck than we were 10 years ago. And basically you have to, and it works for me because as an IT professional, always putting logic into language. I think philosophically as well. And really, the question is something that we don't use the term very often here in the States, but they do use it in the UK, of racialism. Rather than just racism, it's racialism. And racialism says there are these races, and it's like a pizza pie. It's a zero sum. Every race has a certain essence, and you may not make anything of it, but you don't question it. If you forget to say what somebody's race is, you're you're forgetting a real important part of that person. And if you accept that premise of race, whether you think it's real or socially constructed or anything, you're a racialist because you're saying race always matters and you can't leave it out. And so that's just like saying, okay, I'm playing Monopoly. You can change the rules, but whatever happens when you get to free parking, you can change those rules to be whatever you want, but you're still playing Monopoly. And there still has to be a winner race and a loser race, and you're still racing around the same block. So there's no way out of that so long as you are a racialist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. The racialist. Yep.
Yeah, we have a friend, Sheena Mason, who's been on this podcast, who has this idea of a theory of racelessness, and it seems that it's a post-racial idea that you know that a lot of what we talk about when we say race is actually culture, and she believes that the racial language actually continues to promote racism, and
Mm-hmm.
her definition of racism is not just racism against blacks, but a kind of like racialized thinking that keeps us trapped in this negative paradigm. What is your view on that
Yeah.
whole theory? Do you think it's time for a post-racial outlook?
Yes, I mean I do. I agree. We've published Dr. Mason, and I follow her on Twitter, and I think it's a great idea. Uh, and her approach to it is recycling a good idea that's been a good idea for a very long time. Uh, and it's all too easy to assign a racial bucket to culture. And you can say that this is Black culture. And a lot of people say that. But people are just racializing that because that's where we get into the whole mess of cultural appropriation. Well, you're the wrong race to celebrate that culture. And that's I hate to use the word problematic, but it's a contradiction. Culture is a winning way to get through society. They're like not cheat codes, but they're lessons, best practices, and and they're going to be very varied, and they're going to be very specific to individuals. So, for example, everybody in my family, my immediate family, loves The Princess Bride. Now, last time I checked, I don't think there's a Black person in The Princess Bride. And nobody in my family loves anything by Tyler Perry. And those are mostly Black casts. So are we appropriating something, or are we just expressing a love for a particular kind of culture? And as long as you're wanting to tie a cultural expression to a race, then you're back playing the same racial game.
Hmm. I just heard a lecture that Orlando Patterson, the great Harvard sociologist from Jamaica, gave. I think it must have been 2018, on culture and culture as an explanatory factor for disparity in society. Now, unlike the way that he looks at it is that there are these two camps. One is a camp that denies the effect of culture, that says structure is everything, that systemic racism is the only reason why there's disparity. And you see that in the sort of Ibram X. Kendi view, but it's been around for a long time. And then sort of the other side of it that, and maybe you could attribute this to a John McWhorter, that says there is a distinct Black culture that does cause some of the disparity in society. Patterson's view seems much more nuanced to me, and I just wanted to sort of bounce it off your view. He argues that it's incorrect to talk about quote unquote Black culture or white culture. There are cultures. In fact,
Yes.
even within the inner city, there's a multiplicity of cultures. You have a very strong core of church-going Black folks who live in the inner city, who, in no way, shape, or form are involved in, in the activities that are likely to get them arrested or anything else. I mean, in other words, all those groups who have distinct cultures live together, and but that culture still, that subculture of some people might explain part of what we're seeing in disparity. What is your view on all of that, the effects of culture?
Well, as my mother would say, when somebody would say, "Oh, there goes your people," she said, "I didn't raise them." And we know, and it's reasonable, of course, to think of class and to think of your educational background and
Yes.
and what you find to be interesting of culture. I have a little story. Like when I went to grab my fiance, I was living on the East Coast, and we had to drive all the way from the West Coast back to her hometown of Detroit in a 2-seat Nissan Pulsar with a cat in the back. Um, and we got to her mom's house, and first thing, of course, I go in someone's house, I look at their bookshelf, and she had a Negro Encyclopedia immediately in the post-war period. So I pick it up and I start reading, and I find out that somewhere around the late 40s, it was taken with great deal of pride that the Negro man, about 40% of us, could drive a truck. And that was proof that we were improving in America. And I said, oh my goodness, we go back to the time when our intelligence was doubted so much that we were put in segregated troops because they didn't think we were smart enough to drive a stick shift. But we proved that we could do that. Wow, aren't we great? And those kinds of proofs, they change every decade. Every decade it's, well, what do you people want? Or a Black man can't do this. And then it happens, it gets done, and the goalpost gets shifted. So the culture changes. What is considered important in terms of your authenticness changes, and class changes. In 1960, there were about 20 million Negroes. They were all called Negroes, and most of them lived in poverty. And so it could be very easy for anyone to guess the problem with the Negro today is he lives in poverty. So let's have a war on poverty. And then, by the turn of the century, there were 38 million, and most of them in middle class. And so if you're still thinking about what the problem was, then you're reverting back to the Negro problem. And now where we have, police chiefs and mayors where you don't think twice about them being Black, but then we can still come up with this idea that police forces are all racist systematically. So the systemic racism doesn't work very well because people are always guessing about where that systematic racism is taking place. Whereas when you talk about culture, you're like, well, I know this guy across the street from me doesn't want to work hard, or doesn't go to church, or drinks to excess, or never leaves the house without a suit and a hat on, and never curses. So the culture within your Black neighborhood, and who believes what, and who you allow to play with who others' children, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact of the matter is, Black America has become a lot more diverse. We talk about the old school, like when everybody said you got to be home when the lights come on, and everybody's dad had the permission to whip you if you misbehave. And it's not like that anymore. And neighborhoods that used to be predominantly Black are no longer predominantly Black, especially here in Los Angeles. So the culture is fluid, and you can't reduce it to race, and you have to deal with a lot of culture, and it's tough. I think it's especially tough on people like Kendi, who want to reduce everything to something that can be explained, and that makes him the Black leader. And that he's just playing that old game, because we could all be unified under Kendi if we would just accept his premises and his arguments, and then we would be one strong, unified Black people that nobody could stop us. It's not going to happen.
So you used the term systemic racism, but you said can be it can be hard to pin down. But do you believe? I guess I have two questions. Do you believe there is systemic racism in America? And the second question is, do you believe America is systemically racist?
I believe that you can identify racism where it is, and I don't think people have enough discipline to do that. I think if you ask the average person who accepts the premise of systemic racism being the primary cause of where Black people are today, as compared to white, and then you're just playing this comparison game, none of them will say, well, under Obama Department of Justice, we identified the number one systemic racists in America. And back when I did the race man thing, we went through all kinds of stuff like that. For example, one of them was Eddie Bauer. And Eddie Bauer was the big racist of the day, because they would have their security guys follow you around the store. And they had something called non-urban dictates. And everybody jumped on the fact that Eddie Bauer was the racist. And then, nobody cares to think about that anymore. Not long ago, we went through some kerfuffle at a Starbucks in Philadelphia. So Starbucks was the racist place. And what we do is we select, a panoply of victims, from Trayvon Martin to Amadou Diallo to, Michael Brown. And we go through this cycle all the time. And we're focusing on a segment of society that has a hard time, no doubt. But that's not necessarily representative of all African American. I mean, I've been pulled over by cops 27 times before I was 30. I counted them. And I know people, you can say Michael Jordan was in first class, and they refused to give him his champagne. And there are people who actually live in those situations, and there's people who are totally horrified by those same situations. I'll give you an example. I lived in LA in Crenshaw, and there were two special buses that went up and down Crenshaw on a periodic basis. One of them went downtown to the jail, and the other one went to Inglewood to the track. And I never got on either one of those buses. And I would just wait for the regular Crenshaw bus to go by, and I would look and see who are the people who are going to the jail. And I never had that experience. So there are families in America that have to deal with the fact that one of their loved ones is incarcerated, and they have to visit them. And that's real. Nobody can doubt that. But that's not everybody. Everybody who's sitting on that bus stop in the Black neighborhood is not trying to go to the horse track to bet money. Some of them are going to church. Some of them are going to the jail. Most of them are not. And so the question is, what can we do to fix the problem? Because it's a problem whether you're Black or white or anything, if you have a family member in jail. It's a problem if you have a gambling problem. Why racialize any of that? Because what works for you should work for me.
David, I feel like you've got other questions in regards to I know you in criminal justice and stuff like that. So I'm gonna cede the floor for. I feel like you've got some thoughtful questions forthcoming.
Okay, sure. Then since you mentioned it, criminal justice reform, it is or the criminal justice system, it is a place where you still see some significant disparities. There's over 2 million Americans that are incarcerated, and there is a significant portion, out of proportion to their numbers, are Black. Now, you could say that perhaps Black people commit, on average, more crime, and that may not be false, but at the same time, it seems like there are drug laws in place, especially that hold Black people to a higher standard in that way than others. In other words, drugs that are sometimes associated with Black folks are rather than white folks who also are addicted to drugs or use drugs or sell drugs are prosecuted more harshly than drugs that are used by white folks, and so therefore you're seeing still uh, traces of systemic racism, not outright systemic racism, in our criminal justice system. What is your feeling about that whole discussion? Where are you on that?
Well, I think you can racialize crime, you can racialize poverty, and there's a German cat named Gödel who came up with something called the Incompleteness Theorem that we think about a lot when we're building systems in the computer science business. And it says, whatever your system is going to be, it can either be complete or it can be without contradiction. You can't have both. So if you're going to talk about completely racializing the criminal justice system, then you're going to have contradictions. You're going to have double standard. If you tell the policeman, take down the race of the person that you're arresting, if you tell the judge, apply this rule to the sentence by race, or just count by race, then you're inevitably going to have a double standard. So the question is, and I think it's very hard for Americans to get away from the idea that they're doing something extra special if they do it for Black people, rather than having something that's universally applicable. So again, you can definitely go down that way and count the noses, but you're not going to have something universal. So it's easy for me to just say, well, part of my family lives in France. France does it another way. And France is not anywhere near as racial historically as America is. And so, if it gets so bad, maybe I'll just go live in France because I can expect that they'll live up to that, if I speak the language well enough. So I think we're doing a little bit too much navel gazing, and the navel gazing gets racialized. And we think we're doing something, but it's racial, it's on the same monopoly board, and we're not being universal. So the whole idea of America being exceptional just loses when we start racializing everything, because we'll inevitably have contradictions. And these are the contradictions that we see happening among the progressive left, where they're eating themselves alive because they're counting race, they're counting gender, they're counting sexual preference. And you basically ultimately have to decide, when you're putting together a system of laws, that you are going to either have no regard for persons or special regard for persons. And we know that these rules change over the decades. What's special about Black people in 1940? Oh, they can drive a stick. Well, what's special about Black people in the 80s? Well, they're in gangs and they shoot each other. Well, what's special about Black people now? And well, they get shot by cops. And so every time we try to get a generation to say, this is what's special about your race and your generation, and here are all the litany of problems that we've had before, you got to racialize it. And then you have to have a theme house in the university, and you have to have this racial studies and that racial studies. And if you're ever going to codify it in law, you're going to have to deal with those contradictions. Or the other way is you can just say, we're going to be incomplete. We're not going to know everything about every race. We're not going to document everything in our social studies. We're going to reduce our dimensionality. We're not going to look about these attributes. We're not going to try to control for anything. We're just going to try to have one rule. And I bet you'll have more Christians at the end of the day, because Black Christians don't call themselves Black Christians. They may go to a church in their neighborhood, which has been a Black neighborhood forever, but they don't say, Jesus said to the Black man. No, he said it for all men. And presumably, the founders of our nation said it for all men. And so we can go with the universal and leave out some details, but you'll be consistent.
I've got a theory on criminal justice. David, you haven't heard this before, so I'm interested to hear. This is a bit aside, but AI, scares me a little bit, and how it's coming over, so much of our economy. But I feel like if AI could take over one area, it could take over some of the criminal justice system, where you literally plug in, the crime, how many crimes have been done in the past, etc. And literally there's no lawyers. It doesn't matter if you're rich, you're poor, you're whatever. You tag in your name, Jennifer Richmond, she's done this many prior crimes, and the sentence comes out. That's how I think you could solve the criminal justice system. Like, there's no people. And of course, for big crimes and, like murders or whatnot, but for your little stuff where it's like clearly you shoplifted or clearly you sold drugs, like, get your sentence, put it in the machine, your sentence comes out. I mean, is that a crazy idea for trying to what's the word I want to use, address the criminal justice problem?
I think something like that is inevitable, because that's an attractive idea for people like me who are coders. On the other hand, it ought to scare you, because everybody who gets to code doesn't get to be a project manager at Microsoft. And so you have to think about, what's the name of the corporation, the multi-billion-dollar corporation that sells the most AI? Because we already don't trust Elon Musk, and he's done almost what's miraculous. And we don't trust Mr. Thiel, although his stuff is doing very well for me. Thank you, Palantir. But yeah, I agree that there's something like that, and part of the problem is we don't trust each other enough to be consistent. If you've never met a judge in your life and you don't understand why the attorneys that they work with trust them as a judge, as a jurist, you probably don't know anybody who's that fair, who's that even-handed. And we've kind of commercialized this. It's Judge Judy. But most of us don't get to know those people who are really the backbone of the justice system. We talk about police almost to the exclusion of prosecutors and defense attorneys. And we don't really have much transparency into that part, a very important part of our democracy. So I'm a data guy. I would love to show this is what's happened to all of the wobblers in California since we changed the law so that anything less than grand theft cannot be a felony. So you can do shoplifting for $999 100 times, and it never will get you in prison. And that's the kind of thing that I would love to see. But it doesn't change the fact that you can take 100 dead black people shot by police officers and make it appear to be the fate of every young Black person. I can't tell you how many times people have asked me, what do you tell your children if they have to deal with the police? I said, well, how do you deal with your Uncle David? He's a cop. Oh, never thought of it that way. Again, you can take these numbers and blow them out of proportion. I think people ought to be judged by people, but we're not doing very good in the judgment department. And interestingly enough, but I think our society is going that way. Because when I was growing up, there was no such thing as a FICO score. If you had an idea of how fast a computer calculates your FICO score, looking back at every one of your credit purchases and payments over history, it's less than a second. So you could put on your best suit and shoes, and you can walk to the bank and talk to a loan officer. No, you don't get to do that anymore. FICO score. That's what you are. And China's kind of showing us the way how to do social credits. I don't think they let you watch Black Mirror in China, but some of us are going to relent and say, "Oh, let the computer do it." That ain't good.
You're so right, Mike. That's funny. I just have to relay a funny a friend of mine who lived in China for quite some time, and she was just reminding me just today, so serendipity, of how we used to wait in the bars for like there was a certain time, like I think 10 p.m. that they would play MTV for an hour. You know. So yeah, there's definitely you're right about that. I hadn't thought about that, and that's why. But I guess I had thought about that in the sense I said AI kind of scares me. I mean, there's some good side to it, but then there's that other side that is just could be equally as dehumanizing and controlling as anything else. So I got totally off topic. Sorry about that, but you know about AI and computers, and it's fascinating to me, and then how it relates to perhaps how we could solve / mess up the world more. David,
I'm optimistic that we'll be smarter about it. I mean, Gary Kasparov talks about what happened after Deep Blue, beat him, and chess is a new game. And more people are interested in chess than ever. And there was a great Netflix show about it. Was it Queen's Gambit? And people play chess online. Show. And people do teams where a chess computer is part of your team. And that's kind of my particular business, where you're in business intelligence and you think about where you expect people to be biased and where computers are not. Back in the day, a lot of people would run their business by the seat of their pants. And they would just say, "Oh, well, he's a Rockefeller. He must know what he's doing." And the Rockefellers weren't data driven. They didn't have any idea, what their P&L was at a high level, but at a detail level, nobody knew. And we just went through in the 90s and early 2000s kind of a revolution in accounting in business, where even 15 years before that, in the late 80s, managers did not touch computers. That's for secretaries, And then along come a couple companies that revolutionized accounting, and now they're saying, "Oh, well, we'll let this SAP software tell us how we should do our accounting. We'll just the computer says." And so there's been a revolution in accounting and how businesses measure their own money. So there's potential for everything. And as a computer guy, I'm like, yeah, let's computerize the world. But it's more buggy than you think.
You've got both sides of your brain firing. Like you're a philosopher and like a computer scientist. I'm sorry, like my brain is split. Like I can only use one part of the brain at a time. But you you do it all. I mean,
jack of all trades, I guess.
You are. Well, speaking of that, I've got another question for you. So you talked about your dad, and you talked about him being in the Marine Corps, and yet also being a hardcore Black nationalist. And that seems to me, I've got some cognitive dissonance on that. How could you defend a country that you want to leave? And so maybe that's where you're kind of like you came in where you can think on so many different sides of the issue. I mean, you kind of grew up in that environment. But can you talk a little bit more about that? Because when I actually wrote it down, I was like, wait, I had to even ask you, did you say your dad was in the Marine Corps and a Black nationalist? That doesn't seem to jive. So
not at the same time.
plus one on that question. I was thinking the exact same thing. So good. I'm glad you asked.
So definitely my dad was a Connecticut Connecticut Yankee. He grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, in a housing project that no longer exists called McConaughey Terrace. And then they went into new public housing, which was integrated. And he had a Jewish couple on one side and a white couple on another side. And then the next door down was an Irish guy who used to pick up a stick and bat stones into the woods every day, a laconic kind of guy. And he said, well, we didn't think of it as integrated, but it was integrated. And that was public housing in the 40s. And my grandfather was a house manager at Yale, which meant he basically ran a fraternity house as the major domo. And so my grandfather was a self-taught man, very proud man, taught himself, I wouldn't say taught himself to read. I used to think that he taught himself Latin and Greek, but I was disabused of that. But he was definitely a big reader and definitely a leader in his church and knew all the Black Episcopalians in New England, pretty much. He was an elk. He was a Shriner. So he was with all those fraternal organizations, kind of a kingpin in his community. And so there's this kind of old school shabby gentility that you had in those days. He worked troop trains. My grandfather was also in the Connecticut National Guard or the Connecticut State Guard. So he had a state issued pistol that he wore. And so there is a tradition of service, and it wasn't looked upon as something crazy. So when my father got his degree in sociology, and there weren't a whole lot of sociologist jobs because it was a brand new field, and he found that he didn't have work, well, he went to the armed forces, and it wasn't considered such a crazy thing to be an enlisted man in those days. I think by the time he got out, after I was born, it was a different world in the 60s after his 4-year hitch from the 50s to the 60s. And he didn't particularly love the Marine Corps, but he had that kind of discipline, which I think makes sense, again, if you grow up in New Haven, Connecticut, in the shadow of Yale University, and you're a very proper family. And I can't say this without mentioning my grandmother, who was a very stern and powerful woman from a family of women of that sort. And her nickname was Miss Madam. And you could see her in her light blue dress, pillbox hat, circle pin, white gloves, white pocketbook, and she could walk in the downtown department stores in New Haven, Connecticut in the 40s because she was just proper. And that's how a lady behaved. And, I got it from them, slapped on the hands for not being formally correct, polite, etc. So there was a tighter lid on society in those days, and my family was on the inside of that polite society, and that when it didn't fulfill its promise, and my dad didn't get into Yale, then he started to grumble. But then again, he grumbled in the way that you would expect. He's writing fiery letters to publications. He's arguing, the case as people do these days in a very impassioned way, and says, maybe we'll have a new idea. And like many people of his days, he was captured by the idea of a Marxist revolution, and that's going to change the world, and we're going into a new era. And certainly the Negro had to go from being Negro to Black. So it was, he was in his 20s. Of course, that's very appealing to him. But that didn't change the fact that he loved literature. He loved poetry. When he had a chance to do his institute, it was writing. It was never about marching in the streets. It was never about being a radical. It was about expecting that the United States would accept real criticism that you would expect a man of letters to do. So he certainly put down his sword and shield down by the riverside and studied war no more, because he knew he was a marksman. He knew what would happen if it came down to war in the streets. It would be horrible. And so, as a Black nationalist, I think that's just part of the exceptionalism of America, where anybody can think we're going to change the whole government, we're going to change the whole society. I think if you grew up in England, you'd feel that way. You know, I don't think if you grew up in France, you necessarily think that way. But I think in America, you think, okay, we're going to change the whole system, and you can be that kind of radical.
We're facing this sort of stifling discourse now that you might call wokeness, you might call
Mhm.
critical
Yeah.
social justice. What do we do about this? What
Well,
do we do to create free thought, let alone free Black thought? How do we value free thought in society?
well, first, I think it's we should emphasize Black diversity, and that's a phrase you almost never hear, is Black diversity. You know, it was considered a big deal when Mahalia Jackson sung in the nation's capital, and all the cameras were on her. People don't know who Mahalia Jackson is now, and I don't think they care. And so, if you think about African American contributions to music, well, there's R&B, there's funk, there's hip hop, there's jazz, there's gospel. Uh, you know, which music are we talking about? Most people don't have libraries that cover all of that. You pick your genre and you're kind of defined by that. I forgot to say the blues. So just there is Black diversity, and most people, I didn't know until I got in college that there were 4 major Black fraternities, and I pledged Alpha Phi Alpha, which started in 1906. So there's a 100-year-old Black fraternity, plus 100 plus, going on 120 years of Black college men, and you almost can't get that conversation going outside of very specific circles. And these are real, serious cultural investments uh, that that we have to have, that we have to recognize. And so we're fortunate at Free Black Thought is that we just have so much history to draw from, so many opinions over generations and generations about what's best for uh, Black folks. And I think one of the things that we don't do often enough is look towards the future. There's so many of these people are just looking backwards, and they're trying to be a part of slavery, or they're trying to be a part of Jim Crow, and they're trying to say that's my lived experience. But everybody learns outside of their own family. They learn what their culture is supposed to be, and people adopt this, and they adopt it to varying degrees. And I think we are definitely looking at a generation of Black and white academics who were formed at a particular time in our country's history, where my generation was saying, pay attention to the Black experience. We're going to change everything. If you think back to Spike Lee and Public Enemy, and the New Jack Swing in the late '80s, and getting on MTV and Yo MTV Raps, we were getting into major media in a big way, in a new way. Just prior to that, you had all these Black cast movies with the same 3 or 4 people, and we had you think about the gap between the Brady Bunch and the Cosby Show, where we were just saying, hey, we're middle class too, and I can remember the first time I watched the Cosby Show. I'm saying, oh, okay, there's something that approaches what my family is like. How many years has my family been like that, but never been on TV? And so again, there was a period where we were all saying, pay attention to me, pay attention to us, pay attention to the Black experience. And especially those, the most gifted among us, took our places in universities and ran with it. And a lot of it, I have to say, is self-serving, because you say, if Black people like me make it, then we're all good. You know, we could point to Michael Jordan and we say, oh, look, Michael Jordan. So we're all good. And so there has been an extraordinary focus on Black folks, some of which is well-deserved, but some of which is kind of overkill. I think about it this way. Almost nobody talks about the fact that the United States of America completely redistricted itself so that you could have Black people in Congress. And we just completely redid our political system of democracy. And we talk about voting rights today. We're never going to do anything approaching what we did to create majority minority districts. Okay, and you look at Lonnie Guinier, the late Lonnie Guinier talked a lot about that, of how we just completely redid our congressional districting. That's never going to happen again. All right, we've kind of had the spotlight for a long time, and we've been productive, and we led the way for a lot of other folks to take chances. But the black and white thing is so old and played out. It's kind of like, we got to get past that. We got to be happy being Americans. Got to be happy sharing the culture that we do. And if we can't do that, well, it's just going to be another generation of kids that say, everything they taught me was a lie. And
what you're saying sounds to me, about something that you're a phrase that your co-founder of Free Black Thought, Eric Smith said, is like the history that you're talking about, your history, because it doesn't fit the current narrative, you're erased and replaced.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember going to college, and we have this phrase called hoteps, and hoteps are out there saying, because this is what they were saying in the 80s and 90s, that the glorious land of Kemet was where Africans came from, and we're using these Egyptian things, and everybody remembers that video by Michael Jackson, You Remember the Time. And that was a big deal. Everybody's kind of dancing like that and wearing the kente cloth. And there was this Afrocentric revolution that was supposed to put, Black culture front and center and say that we were the originators of science and technology and the pyramids and all those mysteries. And the hoteps got out there and they had their moment. They sold their 50-page books. And then, now nobody talks about Molefi Asante anymore. He's old news. So there's always going to be people recycling this stuff, or as we used to say, trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. And that's ain't that America?
Yeah, ain't that America? Mike, it's been such a pleasure to get your history. You've got such an awesome backstory, an interesting backstory. So I hope that we can explore that again.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Mike.
And so I can have more than one glass. I'll really get loose.
We got to make it 2 hours next time, and I'll get a refill too. Better yet, in person.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Anytime. You got my email, and all my particulars are down in the description, as they say. So you can follow me at MDC Bowen or mdcbowen.substack.com, and of course anything and everything associated with Free Black Thought. To thought diversity. The truth will set you free.
Yes, exactly.
Free your mind. I'm trying to free your mind.
Cheers, y'all. Have a good weekend.
Take care.
Hey, take
See you
care.
later,
Good talking
everybody.
to you guys.
All right, you
You
too.
too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say Hold My Drink and the conversation gets real.